Hello, everyone. Today we have our partners at AnalyticOwl joining us to talk about how location data can reveal important insights about consumer behavior and help drive media performance. AnalyticOwl are leaders in broadcast analytics and attribution space, so we're really excited to have them here today to show how they can make location data relevant and easy to use for radio advertisers. Now I'm going to hand it off to our head of strategy, Drew Brunig, who's going to kick us off. Drew, welcome.
Thanks, Rita. And hello, everybody. Thanks for joining. Today, we're going to be walking through just a little bit about PlaceIQ and talking about what our data how it's collected and what it can reveal about the real world, especially as we're navigating our hopeful exit from this pandemic and all of the complexity that comes with this. That's going to be a theme as we walk through. Even when it looks like everything's heading in one direction or another, there's always complexity below the surface that you have to account for, whether it's in different business categories, different regions, different day-to-day kind of behaviors. Dealing with that complexity, especially as we kind of walk out of this shadow, is of utmost importance to marketers and to businesses in general. So after we walk through PlaceIQ's data, how we collect it, and what it can tell us, we're going to pass it over to our friends at AnalyticOwl, who's going to talk about how they're using it to make better decisions in their own applications. So with that, let's get kicked off. So PlaceIQ is the premier location data and technology company. We've been around for nearly a decade. Myself, actually, just passed my 8th year anniversary, which feels like a lifetime given how much we've done. But throughout it all, we've always been focused on one core mission, which is understanding the real world using movement data that is generated by digital devices. We take that understanding and we package it so businesses can understand and leverage this location-based intelligence to connect with their consumers and better serve them. The way we do this is we see streams of movement data coming off digital devices. Most commonly, we see these from cell phones from a host of different venues. I'm sure you've all opened up applications that say, hey, this application would like to use your location, and you're given various permission options. All of our data is opt-in and is privacy safe through a whole different amount of complexities that we could walk through in a completely different presentation. And when someone says, yes, I'd like to allow this app to use my data, that data then kind of gets used to build better experiences and applications. And we look at that data and interpret it. It's just a stream of latitude and longitude and timestamps where we can see this device moving about the world. Our job is to take those streams of kind of unruly latitude and longitudes, which are just little blips, and figure out what they mean. And our first step in figuring out what they mean is starting to understand when the blips are visiting something as opposed to just kind of moving by. As we see these blips cluster in time and space, we compare them with our other giant data source that we maintain, which is our map of the United States. Our map is impeccably precise. We not only track the locations of households and businesses and venues and all other sorts of things, we actually look at the outlines of the individual buildings to understand where they stop and start, so that if someone's stopping in, say, a parking lot or one building versus another, we can start to discern those things. We basically detect those visits and then start to cross-reference them and understand how they intersect with our map. And as they intersect with our map, we can bubble them up into usable data. Rather than our customers are working with latitude and longitude pairs, they work with consumer profiles that dictate things like this device works out, goes to a frequent gym, visits a gym frequently. It has a long commute. It goes to an office building regularly and its home is an hour away, for example. It frequently shops at certain types of stores or specific stores. Maybe it goes to Target, maybe it goes to high-end malls. Maybe it gets food and drinks. We can see them stopping at, a high-end restaurant or a QSR or what have you. And when we see enough visits accrue, we can understand where the device is likely to live. And with that kind of join to the household, we can append other data sets like auto ownership, demographics, and additional CRM segments. So all of this allows us to understand the consumer behavior of a device, but we don't look at it really at a one-to-one level. We look at it at a community level where we can start to understand the movements of these devices throughout the world to better understand it, the kind of meta-analysis that we see. So with this analysis, how do we use location data to reveal consumer trends? And we're going to use the example of COVID. How far did social distancing take us away from our normal behaviors? Now, we are not epidemiologists. We are not experts on disease spread. We're not using our data to model where COVID is going as a disease, though we do license our data to, or not license, we provide it freely available to the graduate departments at Yale, Chicago's Booth School of Business, the University of British Columbia, and others to basically model those behaviors and understand those, which then get used by the Fed and the CDC. We take our data, and what we want to know is not kind of the effect, the where the disease is going, but what are the effects and the reactions of people to the fact that COVID does exist and it is waxing and waning within their locales. So let's take a look at what the last year looks like and see what we can learn from it. Now, this is a busy chart, but I'll walk you through it a little slowly, and tell you kind of what it means. What we're doing here is we're doing a year-over-year analysis, but it's a little modified for our COVID times. Normally, a year-over-year analysis for us would take the same day in 2020 and compare it with the same day in 2019 to understand whether or not foot traffic was up for that given day compared to last year, or down for that given day compared to last year. The reason I say this is a modified analysis is that once we get to 2021, we don't compare 2021 to 2020. We're actually freezing our year-over-year analysis and comparing everything to 2019 and continuing to, because that is our kind of last normal year that we have available for comparison. So anytime it's a year-over-year analysis, but once we get to 2021, just keep in mind that we're kind of still comparing to 2019. So each one of these lines represents a different sector of locations. So auto dealerships, office buildings, casual restaurants, coffee shops, gas stations, big box stores, et cetera, et cetera. And if they are above this dotted black line in the middle, they are doing better than the same day in 2019, which we kind of consider our normal pre-pandemic behavior. If they are below that line, which most categories were mostly, they are below their foot traffic for 2019. Now, as I said, this is a busy chart, but I'm going to guide you through the big takeaways. The first big takeaway is normally, if we did a year-over-year analysis, it would not be that exciting. Most of the lines would look like what it would look like in February of 2020. As you can see, everything is super close to the one line. And that, in general, was true. How did auto dealerships do compared to last year? For most of our history as a company, they were basically a little up or a little down compared to last year, but they were super close to what the behavior used to look like. COVID changed all of that. And what continues to both shock and impress me is how it didn't change everything in one way. It changed everything just a little differently. We didn't see everything move together for the most part. We see this big, wide range of distribution of these lines up and down the y-axis. It's not in the tight cluster that we would normally expect. It's not like everything went down 80%. We actually see a very even distribution of these lines along the y-axis. So that's the first takeaway, is that COVID hit everyone a little bit differently, and it increased the level of complexity in the marketplace. The model I like to use when I start to kind of look at these boxes, and these boxes here are describing the phases that we identified, the various phases in the behavior. Now, these phases were periods where kind of we saw different behavioral patterns happen. So let me walk you first through the first three to explain what I meant. The first three phases all occurred in Q2 of last year, and they were the first three kind of behavioral phases of our pandemic life, and they should all seem very familiar to you. They were the panic and prepare phase, the quarantine routine phase, and the reemergence ramp. Their names are pretty self-explanatory, but let's go through them real quick. So the panic and prepare phase was 10 days that kicked off on the evening of March 10th. That is when the NBA decided to suspend its season, and Tom and Rita Hanks announced that they were recovering from COVID in a hospital in Australia. These two events were the big movers that basically caused everyone to realize this thing was going to be on our shores, and everybody better prepare. For 10 days, the world basically split in two. If you were a venue where people could stock up for the coming quarantine, so grocery stores, dollar stores, liquor stores, big box stores, you saw your traffic go up 20 to 40%. If you weren't that, you saw your traffic go straight through the floor. It just went right through the bottom of the breakdown. Everybody avoided you. For 10 days, all of the normal weekly rhythms that we track were gone. This period in time was unrecognizable. After 10 days of panicking and preparing, everybody ran home and stayed at home as much as possible. As you can see here, it was basically everything was below the kind of 2000 line, and some things were down 90+%. And everyone stayed at home. One of my favorite examples here is this little teal green line. As you can see, it's really low, and right after this, it snaps back up. This is nature and outdoors. This is, local parks, public parks, beaches, everything else. And you can see it's even during this quarantine routine, it's super down. This was a very scary period where we recognized that COVID was scary, but we didn't understand how it could spread. So as a result, that kind of is a multiplication on our anxieties. This quarantine routine period lasted 3 days. And then it started to ease up. All the kind of the big sieges in New York and Los Angeles and Seattle kind of started to let up. Easter hit, everybody's like, I'm going to go. Everyone realized that restaurants were still open, and they went out and rediscovered them. And for a period of 2 months, everything started to come back. And what it did is it established its new baseline, its new level of foot traffic. So as you can see, these three kind of phases were unique behavioral phases. Throughout the rest of the year, what is most impressive, this kind of reemergence ramp stops as we first got some cases in Arizona, New Mexico, Florida, California. You start to see that summer spike. Everything, that's when the brakes pumped and everything kind of got locked into the levels that we would see pretty much locked in until recent history. And I'll talk about that in a second. Now, what is the mental model? The mental model I use to kind of conceptualize this in my head is that of a snow globe sitting on a shelf. You have this snow globe sitting on a shelf, and this is this period right here, this February 2020, where everything is evenly distributed, it's stable, nothing's happening, and then you just shake it up violently for these 10 days. It circulates around for this quarantine routine, and then over 2 months, it settles back down. And after this, for the most part, things are pretty stable. All the volatility is out. You don't see these big 10, 20, 30, 40-point moves. You just see everything pretty flat. Everybody adjusted to the pandemic and then locked in their behaviors by the end of Q2. And so what happened is the volatility was gone, just like in the snow globe. The snow was no longer floating in the air, but it had been completely redistributed, and an amazing amount of complexity had been increased, both in the way that these categories were distributed, and if you peek below these, the kind of granularity and variety of responses that you saw at the state, county, even town level was quite tremendous. So all of that ran through. We went through the holidays, had some little spikes as we went through our curve. This is kind of our worst COVID curve, which you can see a little bit of some hiccups here, but it still was pretty stable at the top end. And then we get into our second reemergence and we see this big spike. And this big spike was the confluence of basically 5 events that all hit at the same time, that all pushed everyone out to go outside and kind of experience, life again. Those 5 events were the major decline in cases that occurred over the January winter period. The second thing is that vaccination, while not widely available to all by this point, had made significant inroads in the over 65 set. And this is important because a lot of the over 65 people were just not leaving their houses, and now all of a sudden they are vaccinated and they have re-entered society. So it's not just that people are going out more, it's a whole new group of people who weren't going out at all who've started going out again. The third thing was weather. This is right at the end of the big Texas and winter storms. This is right when they ended. Everybody was kind of hunkered down and kind of staying put while the weather raged outside. The fourth reason is stimulus hit around this time. Our wave of stimulus hit. And then the fifth reason is largely psychological. We were about almost a year's worth of adjusted living at this point, and that deadline loomed large in our minds. And I'll encourage people to just look, I'm getting out there. I don't care what the risk is. I have major quarantine fatigue, and I need to run out. And so what happened is we saw this major jump in activity. And at first, we actually even thought it was a bug. It was such a coordinated activity. But as you started to dig in further, you started to see these nuances that reflected adjustments in human behavior. First off, is you saw spikes to things you wouldn't expect. So take a look at this red line right in the middle. This is big box stores. It saw a jump of about 15 percentage points. And I wouldn't have expected big boxes to have a jump because they've been kind of hovering around 90% of traffic. They already had most of their traffic back because they figured out how to do business during COVID, and people realized the risk was relatively low. And it got a big bump because everyone was just outside. But look at where it ends up at the end of this spike. It ends up right back where it started. It kind of gave up all its gain. It went back to its kind of 95% of traffic. Now compare that to this salmon line right here. Sorry, we've got lots of lines, which means we have lots of colors. I apologize, but we do the best we can. This salmon line is super interesting because it's fast casual restaurants, which now you can go to with more flexibility, and you can eat indoors, and you can do all these other things. They saw a massive jump, but look at where they ended. Whereas they started right around the big box level at about 90% of their traffic, but they ended this curve at about up, 20 points. That's big. They have since regressed a little bit back to the mean, but you just see continual enthusiasm for all of these new behaviors. Another good example down here is movies. See, this line kind of looks like a sawtooth, this dark purple, and that sawtooth are the different releases that we see, and that is continuing to gain upwards. So we are seeing a strong and steady reemergence. Now, like I said at the beginning, one of the big themes here is that COVID increases complexity, and unfortunately, our return to normal does not mean a diminishing of that complexity. Complexity still remains high. Let me give you an example. Here is a metric that we call DEX. We don't actually call it. This is created by those academics I talked to you about before, the graduate departments who are using our data. They created this metric called Device Exposure Index, which measures the movement activity and social activity of devices based on how many places they visit, and are the places they visit places that other people are visiting. And so you can see the normal in American life was about 160. It then plummeted to basically 40 during the height of our quarantine, recovered to about 100. We saw some increased activity around Thanksgiving when people gathered, and holiday when people Christmas when people gathered even more. Then it reverted back to kind of the lowest it's been since April, but now it's screaming back upwards. It's not back to normal, but it's almost kind of a second Christmas during this. Now, this is at the national level. If I break this down by state, you can see the differences are incredibly dramatic based on what state you're in. At the top, this light blue line is Oklahoma. Oklahoma's normal was about 180, 190, let's call it 190. And now it's above 260. So you can see that someone like Oklahoma is so happy to be outside that their activity has increased way beyond even normal numbers. It has since kind of regressed back to normal. But this enthusiasm that we saw across this state was dramatic. We saw that in Oklahoma, we saw it in Arkansas, and we also saw it in Indiana. These are kind of the top 3 states. Most states were, like New York, were generally in line with what the US norm is. But where I live on the West Coast, we've definitely taken a more conservative approach. Our normal line over here on the California is about 150, and we haven't even come close to that. We are still down at 60. Last weekend, which isn't on this chart, really felt like the first time that we saw this enthusiasm. And that's generally what happens is you have these certain regions that scream out really quickly, and then their enthusiasm wanes as people kind of go back to normal. But by the time those enthusiasm wanes, the kind of more bigger and more conservative states from a kind of risk taking start to go upwards, and it kind of makes the national level look like it's plateauing as opposed to dropping. So it really is an interesting dynamic that we see time and time again. But even if you break it down by the regions, you can see there's quite a lot of variety among the counties. So you really have to take into you have to be hyper geographic, because you can be in one county and it will be the kind of amount of risk that county is willing to take compared to one county over is dramatically lower or higher. I'm not going to break this down because it's hard to read, but all you need to know is that variance by county is quite dramatic, and variance by state is quite dramatic. It's, as I said before, like you saw Arkansas, Indiana, Oklahoma, these were the big outlier wins. Arkansas and Oklahoma were the big outliers from change from January to March. But most things were pretty close to what the US average was. But compare that to California, where we only budged 4%, as opposed to, and Hawaii and Alaska are down because so much of their normal movement is tourism. And same goes for New York, which is also commuters and other things. But in general, we saw some outliers and we go down. Now, not for nothing, this corresponds not just a lot of people like to think urban rural, that kind of plays a part in it, but also, I mean, the top and bottom kind of big changes in March fall exactly along political divides, almost perfectly. So how is it impacting your business? Different categories are being impacted differently, and this is another thing that helped us understand that this data was really real. Is that, as I said before, there's certain categories that were already doing well, and there's certain categories that we anticipate are going to take the longest to recover, like offices in college, these institutions that have to kind of plan for reopening. And as you can see, they were the slowest categories to get that jump during the big kind of February, March reopening. And all of these other things here were things that were doing pretty okay, with the exception of gyms. This is kind of a slower reopening because of a whole host of reasons. One of the things that we're seeing with gyms is people are taking a while to snap back to gyms because they've adopted new replacement behaviors. They've bought a Peloton in their house. They're biking outdoors. They're going for hikes. They're still doing those things, which is why gyms is slow to recover. But that's kind of a micro story rather than a macro story. If we look over here and see who the biggest gainers are, they're all the things we want to do that we haven't been able to do. Family entertainment venues were up 64% from January to March. Motorcycle dealerships are up 60%. I find that one funny, which is the idea that, hey, I'm going to be really cautious and sit at home and not catch anything. And the first thing I'm going to do when I can do things is go to the place where I can buy something that may kill myself. Surprisingly enough, there's historical precedence for this. After pandemics, people tend to take larger risks because they want to go out and live their life, and we've seen that not in our data, but historically, if you look at the case studies for other pandemics and things. Luxury hotels are massively up, coffee shops are up, movie theaters are up, beauty and retail gotta look your best after sitting in a basement for a year, especially if you're going to hit the bar, which is the next one as well. Same with the department stores, casual restaurants, big gainers. So we're seeing outsized gains from those kind of what I would call luxury categories. And when I say luxury, I don't mean they're expensive. They're just the things that you don't have to go to if you're worried about catching COVID. So how to use this data to adjust your local messaging. And you can use our data to find areas where dining visitation is low. Even though, like, for example, like I said, in California, we're way lower than others, and certain counties are even higher or lower in here. You can use our data to find places where dining visitation is low and then focus your message on delivery or drive-through. So you can adjust to the level of risk people are taking in their individual community. Or you can find places where theater visits are hugely back. Great, I'm going to have more openings there. I'm going to buy more ads there because guess what? The ceiling for the amount of people I can get in the theater is much better there because the people are actually going outside. And look at your category yourself, and then kind of use that data to drive more efficient advertising. Meet people where at the level of risk they're willing to take rather than just making assumptions about what that is. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to the AnalyticOwl team to show you how they take the input from our data and bring it down to brass tacks and make it relevant to y'all's business.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Paul Agassi, Chief Revenue Officer for AnalyticOwl. And my background is mainly in station and sales management. So I have the most experience in taking this data and connecting with actual clients. My associate, David Shapiro, will be sharing the presentation with me. But we're going to explain how our platform takes this great information you just heard from Drew and makes it relevant to basically to Main Street, to your town and to your retailers in where you live. So there's 5 points that I want to make clear before David starts. And that is, believe it or not, I've been told that there are other other broadcast attribution companies out there. It's hard for me to believe, but I've heard there are. Not every one of them, if any of them, have a foot traffic partner like we do. So that's number one. Number two, it extends the conversation with the client about their business with relevant information that's centered on their locations. Third, it reveals clear takeaways and action steps. Fourth, which as a former sales manager is probably most important to me, is that this is a new business development tool. To be able to do some research on, let's say you are in Detroit and you're pitching a sandwich shop that has 15 locations, you're able to get data on foot traffic on those locations before you make your first outreach to that client. So your VBR could be something like this. We've noticed that your traffic is light from 10:30 to 12:30. And we have a morning show in place on our platform that could drive traffic where you need it the most. Can we have a conversation about that? Really, really moving forward with data in that conversation. That's a fantastic tool. And then lastly, and maybe most importantly, it's easy to set up and the reports are easy to read. So I'll let David take the first slide from here and away we go.
Great, thanks, Paul. So those of you who, whether you work with AnalyticOwl or PlaceIQ or both or neither, you might be familiar with what we do on the website, matching response to ad spots. This just essentially extends that to the use of foot traffic correlated back to activity generated by ad spots as well. If you already have seen our dashboard, you know how easy it is to connect an advertiser already. Foot traffic is actually even easier. All you have to do in the platform is click a little magnifying glass. It will actually search for an address for the advertiser for you. It'll show addresses that come back from Google, or you can enter one manually. Takes about 30 seconds. The best part is there isn't anything to do on the client side. When we work with web data, there's always a requirement that's, the client takes some action and shares that data with you. For this, as Paul mentioned, it's a great new business tool, and it's a great kind of account servicing tool also, because you can plug in and pull that data without setting any expectations on the client side. You can work with it right out of the gate, find some stories and show it if there's a clear story, and not show it if you can't find a clear story. Of course, we're always around to help you find those stories, which do exist in just about every data set. I think Drew did a great job of saying how it generally works. We take all their copious foot traffic data, and then we match it to the air times of the broadcast spots, and basically show hourly, daily, weekly, monthly trends in user behavior correlating back to that broadcast schedule. It's not the same burst methodology. Someone heard the ad and immediately ran to the physical location, because depending on the category, someone might not show up within 8 minutes or 30 minutes or 2 hours of an ad. So what we tend to look at are the hours when you're airing spots, are the days of week, are the days when you're airing spots compared to the days you're not airing spots show more foot traffic? Did the weeks and months immediately following the start of a campaign lead to an increase in foot traffic as well? Those are some proof of performance indicators that are really helpful for certain business types that don't necessarily traffic in web visits as much as they do local foot traffic. And what this does is it kind of makes your data offerings more robust to your clients. There are going to be some that are more web than foot traffic, some that are more foot traffic than web traffic, some that are only focused on one or the other. But then you have some it'll be relevant. Both data sets will be relevant for them. So it allows you to use data to service a wider array of the clients you might have on air. And that's a really important way to show physical impact, especially now. A lot of the COVID data, my takeaway from a lot of that is stuff's coming back. So foot traffic is more relevant than ever, and you're gonna have a lot of businesses who've been off air for maybe a year plus now coming back, trying to drive people into their physical locations that are now open. The benefits to you and your teams, as Paul mentioned, it's a great way to prospect. I'm going to kind of take these bullet points in opposite order. It's a great way to plug in data and show up at that first meeting, or reach out, as Paul said, with a VBR that is geared towards winning a meeting by starting with data. You immediately position yourself as someone that works from that position of I know, not I think and I feel. Is I know you have an opportunity. I know that you do your best business during these hours or your worst business during these other hours. I can help with a directed campaign that can either do more of what's working or can address the times where you don't have as many people coming to the location because that's costing you potential revenue. It's a great retention point to show the impact the campaigns are having. And it's a great way to upsell existing clients because you can talk to them about those same opportunities. Everything in general is working pretty well, but I noticed from 4 to 6 p.m. traffic is really through the roof. Let's incentivize people to show up there. Or maybe for another business, traffic is a lull from 11 to 2 in the afternoon. Let's run a campaign that incentivizes people to show up when the traffic is usually down. And then everyone knows what success is going to look like from that new campaign. So it's a great way to do a little bit more for existing clients. Go to the next slide, and I think Paul and I will probably just keep alternating here.
Okay, well, this is a little easier than the last slide. So we're looking at foot traffic by day of the week. And this particular business is not open on Sunday, so there's no traffic there. But then you kind of look at the progression from Monday, Tuesday, all the way to Saturday, which is the top day. So we definitely can isolate an opportunity on Monday to maybe increase foot traffic. And as David pointed out, in terms of upsell, maybe it'd be a good opportunity to run some vertical rotated spots on Sunday, especially, from noon on, to drive traffic to that location on a Monday. The spot rate usually is inexpensive on Sunday, and frequency will deliver potentially more foot traffic on a day where you have the least foot traffic. So once again, a report that's easy to read and has a really specific takeaway.
And with the exception of these green and red boxes you'll see that we put on here to make the deck easier to follow, these are actual screenshots from the platform. This is how the data is visualized within the attribution platform. So, these, as Paul said, it's really easy to read. These insights will jump off the page at you and will be there to help. But again, it is a great way to highlight an opportunity and suggest either a new campaign or an addition to an existing campaign that specifically addresses a clear business need. And most businesses don't already have this data for themselves because they won't pay for it. So just by virtue of working with you, they get all this key business intelligence that they never had access to in the past. Let's move on to the next one. So here's another example of identifying either a category where everything is working well and we want to do more of that, or lifting up what isn't working as well. This is for a mattress store, and this is by hour of day. So we can see late morning, early afternoon, and even like right at 1 o'clock, that's their peak time for people coming into their stores. They could do more to drive people then when they know that their audience is more likely to come interact with them. Or they can focus on later in the evening, that 4 to 6 o'clock time, try something different, whether that's a new offer or a promotion, a different message that talks about, right after work or right after school, a teacher's event, after 3 o'clock when everyone else is still at work, but they're off. There's a lot of different things you can try to lift that up. And again, the best part of it is everyone knows what success is going to look like. So there's a great safety net to that upsell, saying we're going to do this for a month or 2 months or 3 months, and we're going to look for increases in this 4, 5, and 6 o'clock hour. Or we're going to do this for a similar time, and we're going to see even higher spikes in the 11, 12, 2, and 3 o'clock hours. Leaning into what's working best or lifting up what isn't working as well.
Yeah, and this is a good way to communicate with your client, because maybe at 12 o'clock they're at capacity. Maybe you need a salesperson to show someone a mattress, and you really don't want any more customers at 12 o'clock. So being able to walk into a business and say, look, we're going to try to shift some of your traffic towards nights, and here's how we're going to do it, that becomes very valuable. Or if the client says, no, we have the capacity. We absolutely do. We have 3 employees at noon and 1 in the evening. So then you can say, okay, then let's just load up when traffic is great. But it's that conversation with a client and that framing kind of spirit of collaboration where you're asking questions. And that is just so valuable for a salesperson to be able to be more collaborative than just saying, your traffic is not great here. Here's an idea to improve it. It may not be what they want or need.
And it helps you communicate what they need. Like there's a quote I love, and it's there's no proof that he said it, but it's always attributed to Henry Ford, who said, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. So you can't always rely on someone to know what they really need. When you can share that with them, it cements you and your teams as the experts in doing this, showing them here's a business need that we can address for you. All right, we can jump to the next slide.
Okay. Okay, so here's the proof in the pudding. We're able to look at this location, and we're able to look at what was traffic like the days they were running commercials versus the days they weren't. That's why we created this off-air, on-air comparison. And you can see the orange box at 142 is significantly higher by 50% over the blue box at 93. So we know that the days this particular client were running commercials delivered a 52% higher foot traffic number than the days they weren't. I mean, that can be really, really valuable when it comes to attribution and belief and being able to see what really drives traffic. And we know that this is one of radio's greatest strengths because of its in-car listening and being physically close to a retailer when they hear a commercial. And this is a perfect example of that. And then there's a little deeper dive into actual days and hours. But this is something that clients really, really resonate with when you're able to show that when you're running advertising, your overall traffic, whether it's web traffic or foot traffic, has been increased. So this is a slide that's really, really worked well for us.
Next one. So here's another interesting use case for someone with a lot of locations. So this is tracking a huge big box store all over Michigan. some of their stores were exposed to radio advertising for a certain product, and another group of stores were not. So this shows an example of how we can, use PlaceIQ's great location data for multiple locations for an advertiser. And I just kind of cherry picked 2 of them out of here to show an exposed market, which is the data at the bottom of the slide on the right with the green border, compared to an unexposed market, which is the one in red. And you can see the clear difference within the date range. There were over 100 more, 150 more people visiting the exposed store than the unexposed store. So it's another great way if, you have someone that has a bunch of different locations, or you have multiple franchisees, some of whom are advertising, some of whom aren't, but they're geographically distinct, to show an impact on the ones that, were within the coverage area of a campaign. Moving on to the next one.
Okay.
It's also a good example, actually, before we move on, sorry. It's also just a good example of how we can track multiple locations for an advertiser. So if you have a retailer, you have a tire store, they have 3 locations, 6 locations, 20 locations, or, one of the great bugaboos for website tracking are, like QSR. We always say that, the call to action for your local McDonald's is not like go plan your lunch at mcdonalds.com after hearing an ad. It's look left, look right, find McDonald's, go to McDonald's. So if you have a big, QSR project like that in your market, you can easily plug in all the addresses for that particular brand, and show a general uptick in foot traffic correlated back to their media campaign. So again, just the ability to track beyond just your one location stores, to track ones with more than one. Okay, moving on for real now. Thank you.
Okay, now we're able to look at foot traffic by day and by weather. And this is definitely something that's interesting for markets that have a variable weather location. So depending on how a campaign ran, you're able to go back and look, was it really, was it 10 degrees? Was it 6 degrees? Was it 8 degrees? Those are the boxes in red. And how was traffic those days when it was really, really cold, versus days where it was a little bit better. We all know that being from the Midwest, in the spring, that first 50-degree day, everyone's wearing shorts and they're out and they're, I'm sure foot traffic is high in any scenario once you're up and going. But there are times when weather implicates a change in a success of a campaign. And this gives you a chance to go back, look at it, and once again, give that client more information. So, to summarize kind of what we've talked about, you have this extension of data that we're able to talk to a client about. It extends that conversation. It reveals takeaways that you can have conversations with. It provides an excellent new business development tool with outstanding VBRs. And the reports are easy to read and they're easy to set up. And then maybe lastly, you can actually see what happens to foot traffic, not just web traffic, when you are running commercials. So that's that concludes our portion of the presentation, and we can take questions if there are any. I hope everyone had good takeaways from what we're able to show you all throughout. Thank you.
Yes, thank you guys. We love to see our data in action. So thank you for sharing all those applications. If anyone has any questions, you can go ahead and submit them in the question box. Looks like we have one question so far regarding the data. I think you touched on this a little bit in the beginning, Drew. Is the location data coming from mobile devices, the operating system, or apps?
Applications. So there are kind of, 3 different chains. Great question, great framing too. If you're getting it from the device level, and when I say device level, I mean the hardware underlying itself, that doesn't happen. There's only really 3 points that you could gather data from the device. The first is what I would call infrastructure. So the carriers will sell imprecise location data off of cell tower devices. I don't like that because in general, it's an opt-in situation. It's not an opt-out situation. I mean, it's an opt-out situation, not an opt-in situation. Most people don't know it's occurring. It's also super imprecise, so it doesn't really help you there. The operating systems also are collecting data, but that only goes to Apple and Google, and they don't let that out, and for good reason. And then and those are opt-in. When you start your phone up, when you first get it, set up your new device, they will ask you those questions. From the application level, if an app asks for location data, they are getting basically the same data that the operating system is seeing. It's just, with either specific permission levels or something else. The challenge there is that you don't want to be getting it from, you don't want to rely on only a couple applications, because, certain applications are biased. If I'm only seeing location data from, say, an app where people use it to review hamburgers, I'm going to get a great view of hamburger restaurants, but not much else. So you need, tens of thousands of apps like we see across a wide spectrum that enables us to have a very representative sample of what the US behavior looks like.
Great. Yeah, I think that answers one of our other questions was, how much of traffic are you capturing? And I think that's a good answer, right? Where we're not seeing every single visit, but we're catching a representative view of how people are moving around, and that's what you're seeing in that kind of big picture view.
Yeah, what matters most is representation. How granular can you get it in time and space based off the population you're playing with? And yeah.
And that lines up really
Great.
well with kind of our approach to attribution as well, which is you don't have to know everything to be able to know anything. If you have a good, accurate, relevant sample, you can look at patterns of behavior in data at scale to pull out some key insights to make a campaign better, to target a campaign to certain days and times and people. And you don't have to be collecting 100% of the data to do that. Like the perfect doesn't have to be the enemy of the good.
Yeah.
Exactly. Great.
Cool.
So our last question is, will this deck be available? Yes, anybody who registered or attended will get a follow-up email with a recording of the presentation and a link that you can share with anyone on your team who may have missed it. And with that, I'll just say thank you to our speakers for being here with us today, our partners from AnalyticOwl, and everyone, please enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.